that kind of translate, with a Republican judge? Do you have any kind of specific examples where conservatives typically would take that really conservative path in areas where the law is unclear?
Well, I think that we find that in terms of our sample size of, for example, homosexual rights cases wasn't huge, so we can only take so much from it, but that was one area in which Republicans voted very conservatively and Democrats voted fairly liberally.
So maybe emerging areas, emerging rights where people are like gays and lesbians are saying they should have constitutional rights to marry or do other things. You think in those areas perhaps a liberal appointee would be, or a Democratic appointee would be more willing to take the liberal side?
Exactly.
Now, did that surprise you? That seems, some of that seems pretty obvious. Was it what surprised you most again about that?
Well, what surprised us about it was to see, what's surprising part of it is just that the numbers, in a sense, were less dramatic than we had thought we might find. Mm-hmm. Like you said, we chose fairly ideologically charged areas of the law. Mm-hmm. So you'd expect to find some difference between Republicans and Democrats in race discrimination cases, sex discrimination cases, mm-hmm. abortion cases, capital punishment cases. But an important thing here is also the extent to which we found judges actually influence each other. So we found 3 Republicans sitting together on a federal appellate court bench will vote very conservatively, and 3 Democrats sitting together will vote very liberally.
Oh, so it's kind of this maybe the power of group thinking. You get a bunch of people who see eye to eye, and that reinforces their views?
Exactly.
So what's the lesson from that? If you're a senator and you're being asked to vote on a president's nominees, or you're a president looking, what's the lesson there that you take from that?
The lesson there, I think, would be that each appointee, in a sense, counts for more than one, because mm-hmm. there's kind of their views and then the ripple effect that their views will have on their colleagues. So if one Republican sitting with 2 Democrats actually votes more like a Democrat, and one Democrat sitting with 2 Republicans actually votes more like a Republican, it's something to think about in terms of you're nominating this nominee, but this nominee is actually gonna in a sense influence his or her colleagues as well.
Now, most of your research, and when we're talking about these panels, was focused on the appeals courts, which you make yes. the point, those are kind of the courts of last resorts for most people, very important courts.
Exactly.
Did you say, for every 100 cases you get at the appeals court level, the Supreme Court will take 1? Is that about?
Yes.
So, but let's think about the Supreme Court. Obviously, the court of last resort that does kind of resolve these disputes that have divided the lower courts. Talk about some of how we could apply this to the Supreme Court, because I think what's interesting about the Supreme Court is that now you do have, and you did have, 7 Republican appointees on that Supreme Court, but at the same time it was a court that refused to overturn a right to an abortion, refused to end affirmative action. It took some surprisingly liberal positions. Did yes. you guys look at some of that, and how do you explain that?
We didn't necessarily study the Supreme Court, but to the extent that we find that judges are generally political, but that judges also influence each other, even just having the 2 Democratic nominees on the court probably had some influence. And there's also binding law in a lot of cases. And to the extent that stare decisis plays a role in the rule of law, the Supreme Court follows it.
Well, some of the things when you're even labeling judges mm-hmm. liberal and conservative because of the president who appointed them, did you factor in some other things, like at the Supreme Court, some of your more liberal justices, like Justice Souter mm-hmm. or Justice Stevens, justices who've turned out to be pretty liberal, were appointed by Republican presidents. Yes. How do you explain that?
You know what? That's a puzzle, and we think that it's not necessarily the rule; it's more the exception. Uh-huh. We think that generally, nominees of a certain president, of a Republican president, will turn out to be more conservative. Nominees of a Democratic president will turn out to be more liberal. In certain cases, nominees will surprise the president who appointed them, but that's not generally the case.
And at the appellate court level, is it much less the case? Do judges typically vote more as you would expect? Have you noticed that?
Yeah, I think that judges seem to vote more as we'd expect. Like I said, with some very important exceptions, uh-huh. such as with criminal appeals and other such cases, in which you would expect Republicans and Democrats to vote differently, but we didn't actually find that.
Okay. Well, we're going to take a short break, Lisa, and we'll be back with more of our discussion.
Great. Thank you.